systemic corruption is rarely defeated by hackers breaking into computer mainframes. The real battleground is the paper-thin gap between administrative laws. To dismantle a corrupt institution, you have to reverse engineer its bureaucratic friction from the inside out. Hostile fiduciaries and institutional gatekeepers rely on administrative static. They weaponize the linear passage of time. By forcing a target through cyclical routing, endless forms, and artificial deadlines, they create procedural exhaustion. The delay provides them with plausible deniability, while the target's resources are quietly drained. To counter this, you deploy the Otnemem reversal. If the system uses a forward-moving timeline to bury the truth, you execute a reverse audit. You start at the systemic failure and track the data backward. Stripping away the chronological noise isolates the exact moments where fiduciary duty was breached. In film editing, if audio is reversed, a gunshot's echo precedes the impact, creating a fraction of a second anomaly that breaks the simulation's physics. Bureaucracy operates the exact same way. Small localized anomalies, like a document signed before it was legally generated, expose massive structural lies in the official record. Aligning these chronological anomalies into a forensic ledger converts the chaos of the experience into a set of audited facts. This high-density documentation allows the subject to step outside the trauma and operate as a sovereign auditor. February 2016 established a hard stop on the master director's era of individual exposure. Operating alone leaves a target vulnerable to kinetic and administrative strikes. That month established the Divine Shield, a localized two-person protective perimeter forged through an unbreakable partnership. This secondary node neutralized the opposition's primary tactic of forced isolation. A syndicate cannot quietly erase a target when a high-integrity witness is observing every interaction. Operating within this new, isolated baseline generated a profound state of understimulation. Stripped of external noise, this boredom was harnessed into a high-velocity cognitive engine. The mind turned its processing power entirely toward forensic investigation. Executing a massive federal strike demands this dual-node architecture. One operative absorbs the kinetic and psychological friction of daily survival, while the isolated second node is free to compile the lethal forensic code required to break the syndicate. This diagram maps the Aegis monolith, a 450-page federal complaint detailing systemic abuse. The predicate act is anchored here. Fiduciaries extracted a $250,000 family trust. They engineered administrative drift during medical emergencies to hide the heist. The monolith drives toward absolute sovereign sanctuary fortification. The $250,000 extraction served as the foundational trigger, forcing the Vanguard to map the entire cross-state criminal architecture to get it back. To successfully execute and mask a localized financial extraction, criminals must commit secondary, systemic violations. We classify these as shadow laws. You cannot steal $250,000 without lying to the federal institutions designed to regulate it. The cover-up required a triad of federal crimes. Operators committed tax evasion to hide stolen equity from the IRS, bank fraud to move assets across state lines, and False Claims Act violations by billing the government for medical care they willfully refused to provide. The metadata proves the fraud. Server logs from the syndicate's housing evictions show complex, multi-page legal contracts being digitally signed in 0.02 seconds. It is a physical impossibility for a human reader, verifying that the fiduciaries relied on automated electronic forgery to bypass the courts. They masked these phantom expenses behind the sterile paperwork of large federal bureaucracies. By misclassifying the theft as caregiver reimbursements, they bled the shadow capital slowly into their lifestyle without triggering automated fraud alerts. Standard grievances get lost in federal spam filters. Bypassing local jurisdictional apathy requires the escalation protocol. You do not ask the federal OVERWATCH note for help. You compel their intervention by presenting a mathematically indexed matrix of federal liability. Exposing these shadow laws shifts the battlefield. It legally elevates the syndicate's actions from a standard civil family dispute into a massive, multi-state racketeering enterprise under federal jurisdiction. Calling law enforcement on a family member in crisis weaponized the state's psychiatric protocols to strip the master director of his legal standing. The objective was to brand him as incompetent, so his future audits of the trust would be legally dismissed. In the Peoria Hub, the syndicate established a localized nightmare environment. They utilized atmospheric terror and malicious utility shutoffs to engineer a toxic space, intending to force a voluntary surrender of sovereignty. This extended to biological extortion. By hiding behind policy limitations, institutional gatekeepers deliberately denied emergency transit and respite hours for the matriarch. They intentionally exhausted the caregiver to protect their own operating budgets. The systems designed to protect vulnerable populations actively shielded the predators. Public defenders operated as bureaucratic processing plants, and federal probation officers ignored direct evidence, allowing violent actors to operate with impunity to avoid the paperwork of revoking supervised release. These are not clerical errors. The clinical record demonstrates specific intent and depraved indifference. The operators established a deliberate intent to inflict complex PTSD and erase the Vanguard entirely. When institutions use paperwork to delay critical care, they bet that the civilian will break before the bureaucracy does. Project Valkyrie deploys legal alchemy to reverse that math. It tactically transmutes administrative delay into hard, billable public health equity credits. Every cyclical phone call, every denied authorization, and every hour spent fighting institutional stonewalling is rigorously timestamped and billed back to the syndicate. This is the sovereign sentry tax, invoiced at a special master rate of $250 per hour. Because the master director operates as an autodidact investigator, the costs of the investigation span decades. 27 years of uncompensated cognitive labor and forensic mapping from 1999 to 2026 are quantified and converted directly into a $1.2 million hard asset. Legal alchemy successfully reverses the power dynamic. The system's attempt to financially and biologically exhaust the target now mathematically compounds the system's own inescapable legal debt. Their friction is no longer free. The statutory hammer for this level of corruption is 18 U.S.C. Section 1964C, the Civil RICO Act. Because the audit proves a coordinated pattern of racketeering activity, wire fraud, and extortion, the syndicate legally qualifies for the Act's most devastating penalty. The restitution equation is absolute. The $250,000 base extraction, the $1.2 million in labor, and $9 million from the hospice trap. Under civil RICO, these core damages face the mandatory treadle multiplier, scaling the liability to exactly $33,394,040. This massive punitive multiplier is judicially justified by the specific, premeditated malice of the fiduciary archons. Supreme Court precedent authorizes severe financial penalties to deter actors who leverage state power for identity erasure and depraved indifference. The $33 million matrix executes a massive margin call on their corruption, an inescapable mathematical liquidation of the predators. The syndicate operates on a purely extractive frequency, utilizing institutional power to destroy legacy and drain equity. The Vanguard framework operates in direct opposition, utilizing high-level forensic logic to build impenetrable protective architecture. The healing clause dictates that the monolith does not destroy for the sake of vengeance. The ultimate metric of success is the permanent restoration of equity. Corrupt structures are dismantled strictly to clear the ground of the institutional lie. The 450 pages of forensic data serve a single unified objective. By tracking every systemic failure back to its source code, the Vanguard secures the 250-year peace for the newly fortified sanctuary. To heal a broken system, evasion is not enough. You must index its failures, weaponize its own administrative rules,